Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel this afternoon, which is on Ukraine. Actually, I just lost the title in front of me, but Ukraine-Russia propaganda in the situation that we're looking at right now. I'll give you a quick introduction of myself. My name is Asha Rangappa. I teach at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs at Yale. I'm a former FBI agent who specialized in counterintelligence operations, and among the areas I teach at Jackson is Russian intelligence and information warfare. So I'm really excited to hear from our panelists and their expertise in this area. So to introduce them quickly, we have Sergey Sanovich, who is a postdoctoral research associate at the Center for Information Technology Policy. His research is focused on disinformation and social media platforms governance, online censorship and propaganda by authoritarian regimes, and elections and partnership in electoral autocracies. We also have Jacob Shapiro, professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton and co-director of the empirical studies of conflict. Professor Shapiro's research covers conflict, economic development, and security policy. And finally, we have Alicia Wanless. She is the director of the Partnership for Countering Influence Operations. Alicia is currently a PhD researcher at King's College London, exploring alternative frameworks for understanding the information environment and information warfare. Thank you so much to all of you for being here. And I guess just for our audience, I think that all of us, we're watching what's happening on our TV screens, on the news, on the ground, but all of you in different ways understand that this war is being fought on two fronts, the actual kinetic front, and then in the information space, the information battlefield. And so I think, and that is largely, invisible. It's harder to get to the bottom of exactly what's going on. And so to kind of lay out the landscape, starting from before Russia invaded Ukraine. Sergey, I wanted to get your perspective on what was happening, what was happening in the Russian media space, the Russian propaganda before the war started. How were these perceptions being shaped in terms of the justification for going in, both to internal audiences in Russia, because I don't know that we can fully appreciate, kind of what they are consuming, and then also in what they hoped would be, shaping the narrative more globally. Like, what was the strategy here that you think was supposed to play out?
Thank you, Asha. First of all, I should say that, I'm watching it on the screen like you, but I also have a lot of friends in Kyiv. Many of my friends have parents, grandparents there. It's important. It's such an insane proposition for Russians to even consider this. It's not like, Russia is trying to compare it to invasion to Iraq. It's better to compare if like US invaded Canada. This would be an event like this. It's really sort of, Russia bombing Kyiv or Mirgorod or, all the cities that were immortalized by great Russian literature in the 19th century. It's just really insane, cruel, and fratricidal. Now, in terms of justifications, the key justifications they offer is that it is a war that started in 2014. For 8 years, Ukrainian army was bombing Donbass, and finally Russia had to defend it. Now, it's important to understand here that it indeed started in 2014, and it's a bloody war already. It was before it started on February 24th. About 14,000 people died before that, and to be clear, about 13,000 of them died in 2014, 2015, when Russian military was involved. It was not acknowledged by it, but it was rather heavy. They say, so what they're saying now on Russian TV is that it's still a defensive war to protect Donbass from advancing Ukrainian army. They're not showing Kyiv, they're not showing Odessa or even Kharkiv in the east of Ukraine. No, it's a defensive war to protect Donbass. This justification, might look plausible, especially I think for Western observers, because people were looking how to explain Russian behaviors. They were looking for examples, and one example is Georgia in 2008. And in 2008, Russia exploited the real enemies between Georgians and Abkhaz and Ossetians, to leverage this existing conflict. There was a war in the early 90s there to weaken Georgia, to prevent it from joining European Union and NATO. They are also trying to do it in Ukraine. But in Ukraine, there was no war in the early 90s. There was a crisis in Crimea, but it was completely peaceful. It was political drama. And there was nothing like that in Donbass. So there, they had to plant it there. It's completely 100% astroturf. Ukraine had a robust political system, culture, developing, but it was a culture of resolving political differences peacefully. And it was, people in East Ukraine and West Ukraine slightly, not uniformly, but they have different political differences, but nobody there was interested in fighting. And so everything that was done in 2014 had to be planted from Russia. Now, Russia pursued different goals there. In Crimea, this was a true theft. They looked at Crimea as this jewel of the Black Sea. They liked it. They tried peacefully to take it. And the idea was, we will make it much better. People will like it. And for the most part, they do, except the important local minority population of ethnic Crimean Tatars, who are often persecuted by Russia, because in Russia, even peaceful Muslim organizations are, often considered extremist and designated so on and so forth. This was sort of, but for the most population of Crimea, for ethnic Russians, this was something that they liked. Now, in Donbass, the goal was very different. In Donbass, the goal was to turn it into a hellhole, to create this wound on the body of Ukraine, to make sure that it cannot develop as a democratic country, as a successful economy, as an aspirant for European Union and NATO. And so since 2014, Russia uses force to make sure that this conflict in Donbass is not resolved.
Thank you. And just as a follow-up, I mean, you said that, these narratives and justifications had to be planted. I mean, do Russian audiences buy it? Or is there, how is this received there? And also, I guess the other thing I'm wondering, is the fact that this worked in 2008 and 2014 without much pushback, was this leading to kind of a sense of complacency that this will be that this was going to somehow unfold exactly how?
Well, I would say they certainly, it could be said that they were high on their own supply. Often on Russian TV, they say, the TV nightly news will say that Putin opened a new hospital, but everything is crumbling in the United States and also, by the way, in Ukraine. Now, I don't think this influences Putin much. He doesn't appreciate getting advice from anybody. This war was a surprise even for his closest aides in the government and presidential administration. I think there is an interesting role that Russian propaganda played that I think is not appreciated outside of Russia. This foreign propaganda like Russia Today, right? They had this whole foreign operation, but its chiefs, including Margarita Simonyan, editor-in-chief, her sort of sidekick, a hobby, was going on Russian TV and telling, of course, how great is Vladimir Putin, but also how nice he is to people. That Putin is too nice to Russian adversaries. And, there was no demand for war in Russia. People are afraid to speak out, they have limited information, but it was not like a fervent demand. But there was a small party of war, and this was exactly Russian propagandists, not as their main job. Their main job was, to sow discord in U.S. politics or in Europe, right? But in this case, this was a specific narrative that they planted. I can talk more about that on sort of quite imperialist one. That Russia is strong and it needs to assert itself sort of more as a tougher player on the international stage. And Putin is too nice to people. And this was really a sort of a propagandist as a party of war.
Thank you. Jacob, what about how Ukraine has responded to this? One thing that's been very striking is how savvy President Zelensky in particular has been. I don't know if this is his entertainment background or the fact that Ukraine generally is very familiar with information operations and so maybe more nimble in responding. But President Zelensky, as well as a lot of the media that has been coming out, has really shaped the narrative in a way to generate like this global support, attention, in an attention economy, like be able to get everyone to focus and to also to shape the perception of this. So I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit on that and what it tells us about the limits of, Russia's influence operations, which we always kind of assumed were quite, strong. You're muted, I think.
It's a great question, and part of the frame that I think we should think about this in is that many things about the Russian operation here have been wildly more incompetent than anyone would have expected. From the minor maintenance problems to not giving soldiers rations, to not deploying electronic warfare resources, to getting destroyed in the information space in the first couple of weeks of the war, the Russian state has not played up to expectations. And we could think about a number of reasons for that. In the information space, one way to think about it is that they are facing a distributed network that has a particular ideological view. And as with the ones that the United States confronted in Afghanistan or Iraq, it is very hard for any centralized propaganda organ to fight effectively against a distributed body that is trying to explain a very complex set of operations in a way that an audience is primed to receive. And so all the bloggers in the US and the Ukraine and the EU who are putting out all the good news that's favorable to the Ukrainian side have a very receptive audience. It's very hard for the centralized organs of the Russian state to push back against that. So that's one way to think about this. Another way to think about this is to say, look, this is really strange. The Russian government was very effective in the war in Syria in particular at convincing large portions of Western audiences about some really crazy things. So for example, that the chemical weapons attack in Duma in April 2018 was a false flag operation perpetrated by the Syrian Civil Defense Forces, an NGO that operated like basically medical evacuation relief to discredit the Russian government and traffic in organs. Now, that's like crazy on many levels, but a substantial portion of the population in Europe between 2018 and 2020 was convinced that the SCD were some kind of malefactor that couldn't be trusted and that maybe Russia wasn't responsible for those attacks. So then the puzzle is like, why couldn't they do anything similar here? And I think we can think of three answers. The first is the one I gave you, which is they're up against this distributed network, and that's just hard for any centralized organization. The second is that a thing which happens in autocratic totalitarian regimes is the bureaucracy erodes over time. And their failure in the information space is of a piece with their failure to do like basic maintenance on their trucks and stymied the war effort so far. It's just the autocracies kind of stop working over time. The third is that it's coming. And this is the one that if we were in threat inflation land, I would be promoting, which is that as Sergey identified, almost no one outside a tiny internal circle was given a heads up. And maybe it just takes 2 or 3 weeks to spin up the propaganda operation. And you're starting to see now this new line of argument that hadn't appeared before, that in fact, what Russia is doing is it's going after biological weapons laboratories that the United States was running in the Ukraine. And they're getting some secondment of this from Chinese sources in the last couple of days. So it's possible that that will gain some traction and begin to get action. I doubt it, because there hasn't been a backstory built up for it. And it took a long time for the campaign against the Syrian civil defense to get moving and to gain credibility. But it is possible that what we're seeing, which looks like rank incompetence or incapacity, is just no one gave them a heads up. And it took about 2 weeks to repurpose everyone from other things and get them pushing on this topic.
Thank you for that. Alicia, I want to pick up where Jacob left off. So what accounts for, some of the failure here in terms of just the Western response? I mean, what I've noticed is that the United States has been quite good, actually, this time around in terms of preempting some of these narratives. So, for example, this biolab theory, the White House press secretary actually mentioned it at the press conference on Wednesday night. Like, this is what they're going to try to do, and they're going to try to pull a false flag operation. Before the invasion, Secretary Blinken went in front of the United Nations and basically laid out, 5 different narratives that, may be put out there, which, in my mind, I think as from a cognitive level, really neutral, like it essentially preempts some of these. Is that effective, or is it that they're just not as Russian influence operations aren't as all powerful as we've imagined? Or is this sort of a game theory thing where, Russia has until now largely relied on reflexive control of like its assumptions being put out there without being questioned. So now we're in the second order where, we know that they know that, we're going to react in a certain way. And we're sort of at another level of the information chess game.
Anything's possible. Measuring it to prove effectiveness is extremely difficult. So mostly it's guesswork to say what works and what doesn't. Actually, Jake and his team did a great study looking at the measurable effects of influence operations as well as countermeasures, and found that we actually really don't know that much, especially if it's happening on digital platforms. I do think when it comes to the Russians that we have long overinflated their threat. The media coverage on the Internet Research Agency, which was operating out of St. Petersburg, dates back to 2014, and their tactics were exposed publicly in 2015. And despite that, they continued to operate much the same way. So one has to wonder whether the aim was to be exposed or they're really incompetent. And if you look at some of their tactics, I mean, mostly it's just typical marketing. It's nothing too fancy aside from their ability to hack and leak. Their tactics on digital media really weren't that sophisticated ever. I've kind of been wondering whether the Russians didn't do that on purpose so that it would get picked up, knowing full well how especially American politicians would react and use that, especially if they lose an election, and how media coverage would overinflate it. The Russians have been campaigning at the UN for years now for greater digital sovereignty or more control over their information ecosystem in a bid to prevent social media fueled regime changes that they see as coming from the West. And in November, again, Russia, along with a handful of other non-democratic states, introduced a resolution on disinformation at the United Nations, which now calls on the Secretary General to solicit responses mostly from governments on how to rein in digital platforms. And that thing went through without a vote, so suggesting either Western countries agreed with it or they just didn't have the support to change the wording in it. So I guess what I'm really wondering is whether we didn't fall hook, line, and sinker for Russian influence operations overinflating their threat and thus actually giving Putin, some credibility at home by positioning them as being so scary and strategic. It seemed to, I think, really play into their hand, and maybe Putin just now really believed that, right? And decided that he could probably convince people of this. The other thing that strikes me is it seems a little bit ironic, but the Russian tactics now in trying to invent a pretext for the war in Ukraine really seems like a bit of a mockery of past reasons for American intervention, such as in Iraq with weapons of mass destruction, or what they had been accused of themselves with the Assad regime in Syria. So all of those things leave me wondering whether, we can actually talk about the effectiveness and what it means. It is, of course, pure speculation, but that strikes me as being interesting.
And if I can quickly jump in on this sort of explanation for early failure, I think there is a similarity between Russian disinformation strategy and Russian military strategy. Russian military strategy clearly underestimated Ukrainians. That's why they first tried to seize this airfield near Kyiv with light troops without much firepower support and lost. Then they had to move in more troops, and now there's this protracted starting to be the siege of Kyiv. Similar in disinformation space. I think initially they were not focused on the Western audience. They were focused on Ukrainian audience. And the message was really not matched well with their capabilities. Capabilities of Russian foreign propaganda, they're especially good in this sowing discord, confusion, trying to throw everything against the wall and see what sticks. The idea is it creates this sort of information chaos, and like Kasparov likes to call it, annihilate the truth. In this case, their task was very different, very specific. They had to convince Ukrainians of one specific factual thing, that Ukrainian state is crumbling, that Ukrainian army is surrendering, and Ukrainian leadership is fleeing. And this sort of, they had no reputation to stand on, but this was never their idea. The idea was to present this multiple different versions of distorted reality to confuse everybody. In this case, they failed to convince people that Zelensky left to Poland or to Germany because he's still in Kyiv. So Russian domestic television, for instance, it's reduced to, showing this frame by frame sort of captions of Zelensky's videos and saying, maybe there is something wrong with this picture behind him. We will not speculate what it is, but there is maybe something wrong. So this sort of one factual thing that the goal was to prove to Ukrainians, this is not what Russian propaganda ever was good at.
Yeah. Just to add one thing to that, if it's okay. It also seems like the Russians are planning from a 2014 handbook when they did have defectors. When they took over Ukraine, you had some high-level Navy defectors, SBU, who went over to them. And so again, maybe they had a belief that this would happen, but and taking for granted that there was actually a functioning Ukrainian government at this point.
Yeah. This is for any of you. I mean, how important are the images, the speeches from Zelensky in kind of how in the continuation and what's going to happen moving forward? I mean, I think it seems to me that in addition to making sure that the narrative is largely balanced towards Ukraine, there's also just the glorification of Zelensky, this hero, this fighter, really then changes some, I would think, calculus for Russia. I mean, if he were to be assassinated now, he becomes a martyr. Like it could galvanize people even more. I'm just wondering how these things intersect and what you anticipate or would see from the Ukraine side moving forward. Jacob, do you want to jump in? You're muted again.
I think the hopeful side would say that once the narrative has kind of been set and you have a proliferation of voices coming in the way you do now, with all kinds of media being produced all the time, that's videos of this, that, and the other thing, which are being selected for ones by most of the people posting them to be things that are favorable to the Ukraine, it's going to be very hard for a counter message to punch through at this point. The narrative of heroic Ukrainian resistance has largely been set in Western Europe and the US. And I think it's going to be very, very hard to break that down. And in some sense, the thing that, as Sergey pointed out, the Russian organizations are optimized to do, creating confusion. If that happens now, the thing people will fall back on is the heroic Ukrainian narrative and not something else. So I actually think the major battle here was probably won from the perspective of the Ukrainian side in the first few weeks of the war.
Yeah, and on that point, Sergey, can you talk a little bit about how Russian media is responding to this catastrophic failure? I mean, it seems like there is, there's not a lot of popular support. It's waning. So now they have to really limit the amount of information that gets to, to Russians in order to, keep the myth alive. So it's going from the fire hose of falsehoods, having so many things out there that you just don't know which way is up or down, to closing things down in a much more traditional authoritarian approach. And I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about that transition.
Right. I just wanted to also, I think, very important to acknowledge what Jake was talking about, how this narrative was set. This is, Ukrainians can thank themselves for that. They were ready, the military was ready as compared to 2014, and journalistic community, I think, both in terms of debunking fakes and generally reporting what is going on in Kyiv or in Lviv or in Kharkiv. I think this was, these people are risking their life for that, and I think we all should be grateful. And that this narrative was set. This is thanks to the heroic efforts of Ukrainian journalists. Now, what Russia certainly is doing is trying to sort of go back, on the menu of options. They became famous in the late 2010s, right? In engagement with people through these bot and troll factories, hacking and leaking and so forth. Now they're going back to traditional offline means of controlling information and also new technical online means. So in terms of offline means, they're simply intimidating people. I know a friend in Moscow, a pregnant lady who didn't, because she's pregnant, didn't intend to go to protest, but she just reposted on Facebook a call to go to protest the war. And same day, the police came to her apartment and she was taken to the police precinct and sent to court and given a fine. And this was before this new law that, sort of this war censorship law that gives people 15 years of prison time if they say something that Russian government doesn't like about Russian military. So offline means are at work for sure, but also online. And in this case, I think a lot of, again, sort of Russia was quite innovative in this space recently, similar like in engagement. They were trying to negotiate with Western platforms. They were quite patient, they were flexible. They asked them, will you implement 50% of our blacklist? We will start with child pornography, everything we agree on, right? And then now they're just simply kicking them out, blocking, banning everything, both in terms of social media, but also media, BBC Russian or Medusa or anything. And I think this is hugely important because in Russia, I think Russian media and Russian people in Ukraine, they also help to set this narrative in Russia that what the government is saying might not be true. And even Zelensky addresses that you mentioned, the fact that Zelensky sometimes speaks in Russian and can address Russians in Russian, I think is hugely helpful. So Russian government, because it has trouble in pushing its own narrative and these other narratives are getting through, this is why they crack down so hard on all social media and all news media that they cannot control. And they forcibly closed the last independent TV channel, the last independent radio station. I think that there is one last newspaper still standing. Dmitry Muratov, editor-in-chief of that newspaper, he got Nobel Peace Prize last fall. But they had to sort of pivot from, telling people the news every day to more sort of opinion and commentary, because when they tell the news, they cannot call the war because it's against the law. So it's sort of, even for them, it's really hard to cover it.
Thank you. Alicia, you had something to add to that?
Yeah, well, first thing is there were some actions taken by the West that I think played into Putin's hand to be able to shut down the digital platforms, which was not very strategic on our part. And by that, I mean the pressure from some Western governments to force digital platforms to ban Russian officials and Russian state TV. That gave Putin a card to be able to lock those platforms down. That's not to say that he wouldn't have done it eventually, but sometimes we don't really think through the cascading effects of what our choices are for governing in the information environment. In terms of Ukrainians, I think, capturing hearts and minds in the West, there's so many Ukrainians who speak English and speak English well. So there's a lot of very easy content to be able to get that message out in a way that's very easy to understand. The other factor is there is a huge Ukrainian diaspora in the West. I mean, in my country, Canada, which, by the way, Sergey, that was a perfect example of if it would be like the US coming in. We've had a long history of a Ukrainian population that has had political influence and has done really well at advocating Ukraine's cause for a long time, even before 2014. In fact, our deputy prime minister is of Ukrainian background. And so I do think that these channels help get messaging out there in a very meaningful way.
That's such a great point. To pick up on something that you mentioned, and this kind of goes to a question that someone has. The question is, what are Western media and government information agencies doing to counteract the Russian disinformation campaign? And I guess just to flesh that out, you mentioned something like a menu of options or what the options are. And, it's always seen that the reason that we kind of overestimate or overplay Russia's capacity is that, there's an asymmetry here, that they are able to exploit things that make it harder for us to do there because they are a closed society and they take advantage of, these platforms and stuff. What are our options? I mean, is it what we've been doing, which is basically the truth, like weaponizing the truth and preempting falsehoods in a way that prevents them from taking root? What else can be done from the government perspective? I know there's a lot of platform-based stuff, but I'm just wondering from government policy options. And that's for anybody, but Alicia especially. I know this is you focus on this. I don't want to put you on the spot though.
Well, what we've seen, especially coming out of the US, is as you mentioned earlier, prebunking, essentially calling out what possible excuses Russia may be inventing to justify their invasion and their war. Obviously, at the platform level, that seems to be where the initial and quick reactions were in terms of increasing digital safety practices, banning certain content, trying to get a handle on it. I mean, the consequences of that level of intervention are longer term. So we do have a bit of a challenge here in that the majority of those platforms are headquartered in the US. If they get taken down, which they have widely done in Russia, this could be a signaling to other authoritarian governments that this is a way to go, opening up the path for non-Western platforms to really be operating there and splintering the information environment. So this is really challenging. Some of the governments, as I mentioned, have been pushing platforms to ban Russian content, Russian actors and state media. The other thing is there's quite a bit of monitoring and feeding prebunking that's going on across governments. But widely, I don't think that the West has been overly strategic in considering the information environment. And there's twofold problems. One is that we don't want to be perceived or overly manipulating the information environment because that has consequences for democracy. Our very legitimacy as a state is based on people having the ability to make free and informed decisions. So if we start tampering too much there and manipulating it too much, that brings back questions that are uncomfortable for our own governance model. But at the same time, we're not necessarily looking at the information environment as a system to try to see whether there are conditions that may be problematic in advance. We're very focused on specific tactics and specific campaigns. And I think in the longer term, that's put us on a back footing. I'm hoping this situation will actually change the way that we go about this and open up a path for us to think more broadly about the information environment as a system and how we can work together and articulate those lines in the sand about what can we do, where do we go over, and what kind of norms do we want to see at an international level so that we aren't being overly manipulated or taking the wrong step ourselves. But there's a lot to work out there that we just don't have the answers to yet.
Thank you.
Maybe I can jump in quickly on that. I think I totally agree with Alicia that some of the actions Western governments and companies are taking, they're not overly strategic. And this is a long-term problem. For a long time, Russian government used both as a model and a pretext, everything that was done to counter its disinformation. And, in terms of saying, you don't want, Russian government is saying that you don't want us to interfere in your elections. Well, please don't interfere in our elections. And what it means practically is that they are trying to intimidate YouTube not to take Navalny's ads ahead of elections, even if though Navalny was never allowed to run those elections in the first place. Now, I think at this point, it's especially dangerous because what's now is happening is that, for example, this Cogent, it's one of the backbone internet providers cut off Russia. And this certainly doesn't help Russians access unfiltered news. And some of the sort of progress that Russian government made in negotiations with these companies, I think at this point, maintaining those accommodations to the Russian government makes no sense. These platforms are being blocked, companies are kicked out. And in this environment, for example, for Apple to keep its proprietary VPN service, which is called Private Relay on iPhone, to keep it turned off in Russia makes no sense. What Apple owes at this point to Russian government, and Russians, now they cannot access Facebook, again, BBC, Medusa, Twitter, now Instagram. So for them, VPN is hugely important. And at this point, it's more difficult to buy it because the cards are not working. So if Apple and Google would keep by default turned on and free VPN on Android and Apple devices, this will go a long way in terms of Russian being able to learn what Russian army is doing in Ukraine and not keeping Russians in the dark about the war crimes that Russia is committing there.
Yeah, I think on this point, it's worth thinking a little bit about what the last couple of weeks must feel like for 20, 30 something Russians. Right? Imagine, in your life, if all of a sudden Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, your email, your credit cards, your ability to potentially travel abroad in the future were all shut down. You suddenly had to go back to using your local bank, if you have a local bank that's not a Western bank, checks and cash for every transaction. The business you work at all of a sudden needs to redo all of its accounting relationships. Everything that's relying on Western European or US businesses for supplies, like that's all gone. You have all of a sudden to figure out, what do we do if, say, Microsoft doesn't just stop selling new products, but decides to turn off the Microsoft Live licenses. And so the monumental disruption to day-to-day life, people have to be interpreting that in some way. And there are two potential interpretations. One is there is, in fact, this massive conspiracy against Russia. Look at these coordinated actions. We need to rally behind the state. The other is, oh my God, we're the baddies. And the question I think we need to think about is, how do we create an environment where they can draw that second inference and not the first, which is the one that Putin and the people around him would like and would benefit from?
Do you have an answer? How can we do that?
I mean, I think Sergey gave part of the answer, which is there's an installed technical base that is controlled in Palo Alto and Menlo Park and Cupertino and Los Altos. And that technical base could be used to enable evasion of the state's controls. Now, there's a risk to that, which is that in the long run, you will increase the division, which I think a lot of us worry is coming, of the internet into the autocrat and totalitarian friendly internet and the free internet. But at some point that's going to happen anyway if we're pessimistic.
And just so I understand exactly what you're saying evade the restrictions and then actually so that you can put messaging into the information space to the Russian audience.
Yes, pushing
like
up to
whatever reality. It doesn't have to be like a concerted influence campaign, but just the truth, really. Is that what you're saying?
Push an update to every Apple, Android, and Microsoft mobile operating system in Russia that includes a VPN app. So everyone gets it.
it's not even that we have to push an update sort of, it was turned off in certain countries.
Yes.
You just, it was available in UK, in Sweden, and in Switzerland, but it was not available in Russia and Belarus. What sense in the world does it make?
Yeah, so there are things like that which the centralized control and the way the apps are built now may enable. And this is where we should have had a computer scientist on the panel, probably.
Yeah, and would that be something that these, companies and platforms would like take on themselves to do, or is this like would you expect a government to like think about this as a actual strategy to, obviously it's a good strategy if you're trying to end this thing without, having to intervene in a military capacity. So what could happen there behind the scenes, or would this be, Zuckerberg deciding on his own, which I would think is unlikely for him to do the right thing in any given situation?
I think this is why it's so important to not jeopardize the ties that are between Ukrainians and Russians currently in the form of communication channels. There are some platforms that I'm not going to call out right now that are still operating, and keeping them up and operating in Russia is really key because, as Sergey mentioned before, there are strong ties between Russian citizens and Ukrainians. There are lots of people who have family in both countries and cross over in those ties, making sure that they can still communicate to each other and the truth on the ground and what's happening is really important. I think there's some other factors we need to consider in supporting Ukrainians to discourage some behavior that may be going against things like the Geneva Convention, such as putting Russian soldiers that are captured and making them call their family and things like this, or taking pictures of that, because that undermines their own efforts. And so, again, I'm just going to say this is really about trying to keep those channels open and connecting those people. I think it would be a misstep to try to have social media companies get engaged in any influence operations. And so there's different tiers of things that really need to be considered. There's also a digital safety aspect, both for Russians trying to continue to use these channels, as well as Ukrainians caught in the conflict, that is often overlooked when we're talking about information warfare. And here I would draw again a page from what we saw in Syria. There's a lot of information that can be picked up from a cell phone when you get captured that puts people at risk. So ensuring that people have the tools to be able to communicate safely, that the data that's collected on their phone is not immediately available to anybody who manages to capture them. These are all things that need to be communicated and pushed forward.
Jacob, do you?
So this is a space that in the past, the US government has invested in. So things like the Tor browser, which is a very robustly anonymized browsing system, received substantial funding from the US government back in the late aughts and early 2010s, exactly because people anticipated a need for citizens of autocratic governments to be able to safely access information. And so there's precedent for developing or supporting the development of technology that serves these information access goals.
Great, thank you. Sergey, what about the role of the Russian media in influencing Putin? So I follow some Twitter accounts that, kind of monitor Russian media, and there were some clips of kind of gently, of these, hosts gently, I don't know, kind of pushing back on the war, maybe offering some, narratives for off ramps or whatever. And I'm just wondering, it made me think, like, is this for an audience of one? Is Putin watching Russian media? Is he like Trump with Fox News? Is that what he's watching all day? Or does he watch CNN? I mean, what is shaping his perception? Because, at the end of the day, a lot of this comes down to, at least at this moment, his decisions. Like, this is one man's war. So what are the opportunities for actually using the information space to influence him?
Well, first of all, there is certainly, some moral dissent, not just among sort of usual suspects, Russian intelligentsia, but even, members of parliament, some, government experts in foreign policy and so forth. Given that all of them could be at least expelled from, their position and potentially persecuted, this is significant. But we also shouldn't overestimate that. Putin's power is secure. It was, it will be. There would be no coup. Russian military never plays a political role. Russian security services are under, they, as in typical authoritarian states, they are spying on each other to make sure that, Putin's power is secure. So there is a significant dissent, both in terms of, people going in the streets, which is very dangerous now, and even at the elite level. But the potential to change the government, I think, is not there. In terms of influencing Putin, generally speaking, so as far as I know, it's alleged that he reads Spiegel in German because he considers it independent, and he prefers. As far as we know, he doesn't use a computer. He prefers everything on paper. His most trusted, reliable information source are briefings from the security services delivered to him in red notebooks on paper. Now, and influencing Putin generally, this is why everybody was so surprised, even people around him, even people like Margarita Simonyan, who was basically calling for war for a long time, this hawks, they didn't expect this to work. This was sort of their hobby for many years, but Putin doesn't appreciate people advising him what to do. He likes to surprise people, to be unpredictable, and I think at this point, I think it's hard to say what he will do. I think now there are some real constraints, military constraints. He can continue to fight a war, but when he says that he doesn't plan to occupy Ukraine, I think this is, it would be sort of taking Russian state capacity to a breaking point. Ukraine is the second biggest European country of 40 million people. It's not easy. So even if he puts all Russian military in Ukraine, it would be, I'm not sure it will work. So there are constraints like that. But in terms of influencing Putin, I doubt that anybody inside or outside of Russia can do that.
I just want to pick up on one thing Sergey said, which is what would it take to occupy Ukraine? The kind of standard ratio people think about for successful occupation where there's a would-be insurgency is 20 people per troop. So that's a 2 million person invasion force. That far exceeds the current Russian capacity and is vastly more than Russia could possibly finance now that it's going to be frozen out of international bond markets. Right? Unless China decides it wants to subsidize that occupation, there's no one who can float that bill. And so the viable pathways here don't run through a long-term successful occupation of the Ukraine, unless we see a level of mobilization in Russian society that's been unequaled since World War II. It's hard to imagine at the moment, given what we've just learned about how effective the state is, and massive support from China or maybe Gulf money. So it's really hard to think about how they could get there.
I would also add that actions in 2014 moved more Ukrainians against Russia than had been before. Leading up to 2014, you still had a fairly even split in terms of population feeling they should go into the Russian customs union versus the EU. And with Crimea and then ultimately Donbass, that actually moved a lot more Ukrainians against Russia willing to fight. And I think that's also what you're seeing now in terms of the mobilization of Ukrainians themselves to take up arms and fight in a war that, to many people might have seemed like a lost cause. The fact that Russia has not rolled them over in a matter of days is very significant. The question is, how long can they hold on to keep fighting that? And again, Ukrainians have a history of continuing to fight for their independence. I mean, if you look at after the Second World War, you had an insurgency that was lasting up into the 50s. And yes, it did have some support from outside, but the fact that it continued against the Soviet Union is very significant. So this is a people who will go to the end, I think.
So what is the end game? I mean, if this is ultimately futile, And Sergey, you say that that Putin is secure right now, but Jacob also mentioned that people's lives have been upended. I mean, I know that when I floated the idea to my son of doing a 1-day no screen day a week, like they almost, I mean, I don't know, like I'm glad I'm still alive. Like it was like meltdown central. So I can't imagine if like everything was shut down, for millions of people. And I have to, wonder that his security services are, is he all there? So what is the end game and what role does the United States play? And I'm wondering where also the narrative piece fits into this, right? Because it seems to me that from particularly the United States, but also NATO, that leaving this as a conflict between Russia and Ukraine helps to mount the pressure internally against Putin, because then it becomes just, this is your stupid war that you're doing. Whereas, more intervention or escalation then can create a new narrative of this is, the struggle that he kind of wants to create that can rally more support. I don't know if that makes any sense. I'm just throwing some ideas out there for comment.
Well, this is why I think many people were puzzled by Putin's decisions, exactly because in strategic sense, it makes no sense. As Alicia pointed out, when this is why many people thought that he will not take Crimea, because after taking Crimea, it's not only that he turned the rest of Ukraine against Russia, it's simply, Crimea was very much sort of split down the middle at 50%. Without all the Russians in Crimea, pro-Russian parties never had a real chance of dominating Ukrainian politics, right? And at this point, again, he cannot occupy Ukraine, but without occupation, after Russian troops leave, it's really, I don't know how he thinks he will be able to control Ukraine in the way of preventing it from joining European Union or NATO or so forth. Strategic position of Russia versus Ukraine, I think, continuously deteriorates after every Putin's move. Now, it doesn't mean that I think in the short and even medium term, Putin's power is under threat. Yes, people's, in terms of screen time and so forth, Russia has domestic competitors quite successfully developed under very favorable policies that Putin offered to it in 2000s. The best industrial policy Russian government could provide, they left them alone. And unlike in China, they were not protected from foreign competition, so they had to be good. And so now he has something to fall upon in terms of, providing internet services to the population and to the government. Russian government heavily invests in e-government. It cannot turn internet completely off, but they have domestic providers. However, the screen time, yes, it will be there. But, imported parts and imported cars and imported food and imported medicine, that would be much harder because that you have to buy with hard currency. And Russia will have a deficit of hard currency for the foreseeable future. I still don't think it as a threat to Putin's power. If Gorbachev likes to say, I still could have been your general secretary. If an authoritarian leader like Lukashenko or like people in North Korea, if they are willing to beat their people into submission, and if they're in agreement with their security services, it could be protracted. They can stay in power by force.
Jacob, Alicia, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, the brutality of the system already in cracking down on dissent, dissent that I would say was unprecedented in recent years. I mean, it was pretty amazing that those protests emerged immediately, that you had high profile celebrities and sports people who were coming out and critiquing it early on. But I think as the state uses its own apparatus to crack down on it, that will get harder and harder to surface. I think there are questions, there are certain populations that I think won't handle this very well longer term. In particular, I'm thinking of younger Russians who have actually grown up in a fairly open, thriving country where things have gone really well. I think it's going to be very hard for them longer term, depending on what their political perspectives are, if they've been traveling a lot to the West and have enjoyed those liberties. There's also an element that can ride out a lot of a lot of problem. I mean, there's still many people who survived the 90s. It was brutal. They know how to react, to get chickens, live off a dacha, and be able to cope. So it could take a while before you see a lot of uprising, especially if the state's cracking down. So I agree with Sergey that they could dig in and cope for quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a very brutal calculus here, which we really haven't seen, I think, in some ways since the end of the Cold War, which is that, you know, if you view the great ideological battle of the next 20 years as one between the authoritarian capitalism on offer in Russia and China, in which the spoils go to the top and the people have no freedom, no meaningful freedom, and the democratic capitalism of the West, where most of the spoils go to the top, they're distributed a little more equitably, and people actually have freedom. This is a very stark illustration of how that conflict is likely to play out on one of the borderlands between those two communities. And for purposes of winning that ideological battle, the steady immiseration of the innocent and autocratically ruled Russian people is probably the best thing for the long run future of democracy. For those people, it is a tragedy. And so I think the tightrope that US and European policy needs to walk is to figure out, how do we create a sufficient path out for the Russian leadership so that we can get out of this conflict and preserve those people's lives and property and opportunities to some measure, without giving them basically a pass on promoting a governing system that's inimical to almost everything we hold dear.
There's another element in here that I think is the elephant in the room that we're not talking about, which is the nuclear threat. And there is an element of Putin that I would be very fearful of. There's many, but one is that he was never going to get to retire, right? Like, he wasn't going to be able to leave center stage and be safe. So how much of this pursuit is going to turn into a kamikaze episode? I don't know. I would put that back to my co-panelists to answer.
Well, I wanted to mention something to what Jake said. I think sort of on more practical considerations at this point, in terms of sanctions and so forth. I think one way to look at this, a lot of sanctions were imposed. Certainly not all of them could be possibly lifted in the near future, but some of that could be given to Ukrainians as a leverage in negotiations. And I think giving them this leverage, so that, you know, if Russia withdraws troops, Ukrainians could promise them that Russian planes will be able to fly. This might be a sort of potential route to de-escalation. Whether it will work, I think hard to predict, because it ultimately depends on Putin, and we don't know what he thinks.
This is all taken a very dark turn. So I want to end on, I know we have just a few more minutes, and I'm wondering, we talked about, you know, government responses, companies and platforms, and I'm wondering about your thoughts on journalists in the media, that so much, you know, that this, you know, the entire information ecosystem and how these narratives have been shaped, you know, are so largely dependent on keeping the coverage going. And I'm worried personally, being in that space myself and having seen how these cycles go, that, you know, at some point this will be eclipsed by some domestic scandal or something, or, you know, American audiences in particular are fickle and, you know, get bored. And I don't know, like, how important is it that there is sustained attention, media attention, in order to support, you know, the Ukraine side of the information war, which in turn bolsters like what is happening on the ground?
I don't see Western media turning its eyes away from this, because it is in Europe, and it threatens the stability of that continent, which, and this has been an accusation, not an accusation, a criticism from other corners, that we've been quite perhaps racist in our obsession with what's happening there and not giving enough exposure and coverage in the past to conflicts that happened elsewhere. So I would be very surprised if media coverage suddenly shifted away from this. And in fact, in some ways, I would argue the coverage has been problematic, almost treating it like a sporting event in the way that they've been watching and documenting it. But then again, this is what we have with free media. They're able to cover things the way that they want to, and to try to get viewers, essentially, is how that works, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think the military stalemate, where this gradually fades from prominence in the headlines and continues to be covered, and the Russian economy grinds to a halt, and people begin to have trouble making their daily caloric needs, and the ability of elites to travel begins to shut down as the country moves towards a kind of North Korean autarky, is not an impossible outcome here. And as Sergey said, I think because of the distribution of power in Russia and the successful evisceration of institutions, that could go on for a very long time.
I will only add that attention in the West is important, but I would say even if it fades out from the top headlines on CNN, still making sure that Congress has access to information and can sort of be flexible and changing policies, that would be helpful. And for that, I think one key ingredient certainly is supporting local journalism in Ukraine and supporting those journalists who had to leave Russia. Most of journalists who try to actually cover the war had to leave Russia, because you cannot call this war a war in Russia anymore, and helping them wherever they are in Baltic states, in Western Europe, in US, or if they still could operate in Ukraine, would be hugely helpful.
Well, thank you. I know we're at 1 o'clock, and I appreciate your time. I'm just looking to see if there was any, final questions, but I don't see any. I know we covered a lot of ground. I want to thank the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton, and also the Office of Communications for conducting this series. And I hope that everybody who watched benefited from your expertise. I know I did, and I hope that I will cross paths with each of you at some point. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Asha. Thank you.